Fun to get to be here with you again as we take a few moments just to walk through the book of Acts. And we are starting chapter 5. Before we get into that, though, I was reading this article today. And, the title of the article was "The Predator That Makes Great White Sharks Flee in Fear," which I couldn't resist an article with a name like that because I dislike great white sharks and I'm afraid of them. And so I like the idea that there's something that scares them, to say the least, even though I've never met a great white shark, but I've seen Jaws enough times to think that they're all vicious, mindless eating machines. And if you are, maybe a marine biologist or really like the ocean, you might already know the answer to this question or what this predator is. But I thought it was really kind of fun to read about and learn that it's the killer whale, which is apparently very aptly named. But if you read up on it, it's amazing. Like, killer whales, one, they're huge. They're way bigger than great white sharks. And two, when they get into a competition with a great white, there is no competition. They just destroy them. They just ram them, flip them upside down, and they're completely immobilized. And then they literally eat their livers, and apparently only their livers, which I think is, I don't know, kind of awesome. But what's really interesting about great white sharks, or not great white sharks, but killer whales, is that they're also trainable. If you go to like SeaWorld, right, you can see a killer whale perform, swim with people. They have that big smile on their face because they're related to dolphins, right? We don't even think of them as really being killer whales. We should just call them orcas, right? I mean, they're they've become almost these like gentle beasts, but just to be reminded, because they appear that way, or they even kind of accept a little bit of domestication, it doesn't mean they're not really still very potentially dangerous and definitely powerful, which brings me to Acts chapter 5, that we've been watching the story of the church as it has grown from its inception of Jesus leaving it to his apostles. And there's just a few of them, 100 of them, meeting together and praying and waiting for the Holy Spirit. And finally that happens in chapter 2. And these incredible things keep happening. Miracles keep happening, and incredible sermons keep happening. And people keep joining them. And more people are believing in Jesus and who he is and his death and his resurrection. And all of this stuff is happening, as well as arrests. The leaders keep getting arrested and kind of keep getting warned and this and that. And in chapter 5, there's kind of this interesting transition. It's a very detailed story, and it's very personal, but it's kind of a frightening and even a little bit of a weird one in terms of how things have flown up to this point. And so it involves two people named Ananias and Sapphira. And if you read the story in Acts chapter 5, we just learned about how believers in this group are doing this incredible act of generosity, that they're selling their property, they're selling their homes, they're bringing it to the church so that the needs of people can be met, so that this church thing can continue to function with all these people who've stayed there, that travel there from all over the world. And then it tells the story of this one couple, Ananias and Sapphira, who decide to do the same thing. They bring this money after they sold some land or they sold some house, and they bring it to Peter to lay it at his feet. Only they conspired for some reason amongst themselves before they brought it to say they were bringing all of the money when they really only brought a portion of the money. And in doing so, basically are lying to Peter and to the church and saying, we are bringing you and giving you everything, when in fact they're bringing a portion of it. Now, as we said yesterday, there's nothing wrong with that. There's no command here. There's no like, hey, everybody go sell their property and bring it all to the church. That isn't a thing. It's just as God puts on people's hearts. And so they do this, and it starts with Ananias, the husband, bringing this to Peter, and he has to have this conversation with, is this everything, really? And what's really interesting is, if you read verse 3, Peter responds to Ananias in this lie by saying this: why did you let Satan rule your thoughts to lie to the Holy Spirit and to keep for yourself part of the money you received from the land? Now, he's not saying that you couldn't. In fact, he'll go on to explain it. You could have, but why are you lying about it? Like, that's the problem. And in the next verse he says, why did you think of doing this? You lied to God, not to us. Like, so this isn't just about you lying to me as a person or even the church, but you're actually lying to God. And here's what's really interesting about this idea of lying to God, even though it's lying to Peter. If you go back to Acts chapter 2, when that moment when the Holy Spirit comes, right? God, the Holy Spirit, right? The third member of the Trinity comes down, and there's these little flames of fire that rest above all these believers. Now, you have to understand, if you go back to the Old Testament, which all these guys are Jewish, so they know their Old Testament really well, that what you see throughout the Exodus when God's people are being rescued is that God is always there in this pillar of fire. And this pillar of fire rests both on top of Mount Sinai, where God's presence is. It rests on top of the tabernacle, where God's very presence is. And God is leading them with this flaming presence. And what has happened in now Acts chapter 2 is that it's like this very fire, this very presence of God has now settled onto God's people. Paul will go as far as to say that, don't you know that you are actually a temple of the Holy Spirit? And that's what has happened. So when Peter says, you didn't lie to us, you lied to God, he means that very literally, that God is in his church. You can't lie to the people of God without lying to God himself. That's a huge, huge statement. Now, what happens after Peter makes that statement? Ananias drops dead. Right there on the ground. Some guys come, take the body away, and bury him. A couple hours later, his wife Sapphira shows up. Peter has the same conversation with her and just finds out, were you behind this conspiracy or in this conspiracy with him as well? And then basically says the same thing. Why would you lie about this? And boom, she drops dead. And her body gets taken out by these same guys. And again, it's this kind of weird, like, what is the story about as far as the church goes? But it's pretty important to see something that's happening here as well. That God is taking very, very seriously and demonstrating very seriously, not just that there's this incredible new covenant and this new grace and this new thing that he's doing, but that God still remains just as holy as he was back in Exodus. In fact, they're still in Jerusalem where this happens. They're still amongst all Jewish people who are very well understanding the Old Testament themselves. I mean, they know the stories. For them, this is a picture of, oh my goodness, this isn't just some new thing God's doing. This looks just like the one that we're used to, the one that we know. They know the stories of what happened when people stepped into the holy places and they came with the wrong attitude. They didn't come with reverence. They didn't come with humility. They came with the attitude of, we're going to do whatever we want to do, kind of a thing. And now there's the story of people encountering the very holy presence of God through his people, the church itself, where God is now dwelling and living. And that's a really scary and kind of a strange thought for most of us. But I want you to see just kind of how it ends in verses 13 and 14. It says that none of the others dared to join them, but all people respected them. Meaning, the church continued to gather in the temple area where anybody could come and go as they wanted to, they stood apart because of their teaching, but because of these kind of things are happening. And this story got out. People are telling the story about how this couple dropped dead. And it says more and more men and women believed in the Lord and were added to the group of believers. That people heard this story, and in one sense, it meant if they weren't interested in what was going on over there, they kept their distance from them. Maybe watched with a little bit of fascination. It says many began to bring their sick people, and Peter was healing them. But ultimately, more and more people end up joining the group because they decide this is what God is doing, and they want to come and be a part of it. And I think for us as the church here and now, it's a very important reminder that we understand we approach God through his grace, this incredible act of generosity in the giving of his son, but it hasn't eliminated, it hasn't, if you will, removed any of the power or the teeth or the holiness of who God is, which means we should still come to him with respect. We should still come to him with honor. That word that is used of all the people is fear. And it is the same Greek word for fear, but it also is the same word that's used anytime people approach a king or an authority figure. It means they bowed down, they showed respect, they came with humility because we still serve an incredibly powerful God. And we don't need to be afraid. His perfect love is meant to cast out fear, actual fear, but it is still meant to mean we approach him humbly, that we approach him with reverence, that we approach him with great awe. And we continue to pray for the world around us that they would experience the very grace and mercy of God and see what that love and that respect is all about. Guys, that's the beginning of Acts chapter 5, but there's more to come tomorrow. I'm looking forward to it. You guys have a great evening. See you then.